I'd like to introduce myself. I'm Barbra Dillon, editor-in-chief of Fan-Based Press, and I'm honored to be here today with this wonderfully talented and incredibly insightful group of panelists to discuss how the representation of Jewish people in comics has evolved over time, as well as the increase in Jewish creators bringing these stories to life, and the barriers and industry concerns that still exist, and how they can be overcome. Before I introduce our panelists, I do have a very quick video, as you saw, that I'd like to play for you, and then we can introduce each of these wonderful people. So let me, without further ado.
Hey, San Diego Comic-Con. I'm Jordan B. Gorfinkel. Gorf, which is frog backwards. Gorf, frog, frog, Gorf. Now you're never going to forget me. And I am the creator of Batman No Man's Land and Birds of Prey, both for DC Comics. And since we're at the historic, one of the very first Jewish-themed panels at San Diego Comic-Con, I'm also the creator of the Passover Haggadah graphic novel and the forthcoming Purim Megillat Esther Book of Esther graphic novel. What makes comics Jewish? Let me tell you a little story to illustrate, pun intended. When I was first beginning to write and draw my weekly Jewish cartoon feature, which you can follow on Instagram and Facebook at Jewish Cartoon, break out your phones right now, folks, and follow at Jewish Cartoon, I created a gag that I published in my newspapers. And for the young folks in the audience right now who don't know what a newspaper is, it's when you take the internet, you print it out, and you hand it to somebody. I published a gag that was funny. It also unintentionally maligned a segment of my readership. I received a letter from a very prominent rabbi who gave me some feedback that I carry with me in all the work that I do to this very day. He wrote, Gorf, which is frog backwards. Gorf, your comic strip is very entertaining, and you can continue to use it to tell funny gags and entertain. But you also have a special opportunity. You have a platform that speaks to countless people, and you can use that for the greater good. You can inspire and enlighten even as you entertain. And that, folks, is what I think Jewish comics is. Jewish comics makes the world a better place. Thank you, moderator. Thank you, fellow panelists. And hey, San Diego Comic-Con, see you in the funny papers.
Excellent. Well, thank you to Jordan for that. Absolutely. So again, without further ado, I'd like to introduce all of our wonderful panelists here. In no particular order, we have Fabricio Fabricifolski, who is not only the co-creator and co-writer of Spider-Man Noir for Marvel Comics with David Hein, but he is first and foremost a versatile creator. Through his 25-plus years in publishing, Fabrice served as editor and packager for multiple companies in France, his home country, and the U.S., including Heavy Metal, DC Comics, Humanoids, Tapestry Productions, and Ablaze Comics. Besides Spider-Man Noir, Fabrice released 5 creator-owned graphic novels, including fan favorites Intertwined and Ladybird via his inclusive imprint, Fair Square Comics. Founded in 2019, Fair Square develops, publishes, and distributes original comic books and graphic novels, mostly from immigrants, minorities, and underrepresented creators of the world, an objective emphasized in his company's mantra, quote, comics from the rest of us, end quote. In 2021, Fair Square debuted Noir is the New Black, its hit anthology featuring 16 noir stories by 40 Black creators. Fabrice also created the Jewish Comic-Con, a festival held yearly in Brooklyn from the years 2016 to 2018. Fabrice, thank you so much for joining us. In addition, we have Arnon Shore, who is an award-winning writer and director of character-driven adventures and thrillers where heroes grapple with the extraordinary and in doing so learn important truths about themselves. His film credits include The Pirate Captain Toledano, Glimpse, and End of the Story, and his graphic novel, Jose and the Pirate Captain Toledano, which was the winner of the PJ Our Way Author Incentive Award. Arnon, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much.
In addition, we have Rami Dubrow, who is an entertainment executive with over a decade of high-level operational experience. Currently Chief of Business Development for Ox-Eye Media, an IP company whose imprints include Source Point Press, a top 10 comic book publisher, Deepwater Games, a tabletop game company, and N3 Products, a high-end comic and gamer culture-oriented consumer products company. Previously, Rami held positions as a talent manager, as well as president of production of Viva Pictures Distribution, a top independent film production and distribution company. Rami also expresses his passions for entertainment as a concert producer, executive producer on multiple musical albums, and as a writer. Rami's most recent project is as a writer and co-creator of Partisan 42, a new Jewish comic book series which debuted this past June. Rami is currently developing a new division of Ox-Eye Media, which will focus on bringing high-end comic books and games to Jewish markets, as well as bringing Jewish media content to mass markets. Rami, thank you so much for being here. And last but certainly not least, we have Dani Coleman, who is a writer and educator from London, England. She plays the violin, dabbles in stand-up comedy, and is absolutely terrible at video games. When she isn't writing comic books and novels, she teaches aspiring writers how not to annoy their editors. She currently lives in San Francisco with her husband, creator of many comic books as well, and 2 cats, creators of many hairballs. Dani's debut graphic novel, The Unfinished Corner, is a 2021 National Jewish Book Award finalist. Dani, thank you so much for being here. So I'd like to start with the big question. What is a Jewish comic? Fabrice, why don't we start with you?
Oh, no.
No pressure.
What is a Jewish comic?
Yes.
All comics are Jewish. That's the best answer.
That's
right?
all I got. Absolutely.
All
Yes.
comics are, it's like in movies, like Jewish movie directors, like all their characters are Jewish. All comics are Jewish. Like I say we because as Jewish people, like we represented up to 90% of the creators of this industry. So by design, they are Jewish. But they were also closeted Jewish for a very long time. So I guess now is the time to reclaim that heritage, but we're going to probably talk about it later.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Arnon, anything you'd like to add?
What is a Jewish?
Comic. Yes. Yes.
I think that, yeah, it's really about, to my mind, a Jewish comic is a comic that tells a story about or that grapples with themes that connect to some aspect of Jewish history or heritage or culture or religion or ideas or text or characters or, I mean, it can be a very, very broad, very open-ended definition. Because what is a Jewish? That can also be very open-ended.
Exactly. Exactly. Dani, what about you?
I mean, from a contemporary here we are now perspective, I think a Jewish comic is one that is explicitly by Jewish creators for a Jewish audience, dealing explicitly with Jewish themes. And the more the industry diversifies, the more, not just in Jewish stories, but in any kind of minority representation, the more we get to see it be overt and explicit and hopefully authentic. But with that said, Fabrice hit the nail on the head that this entire industry was founded and built up by Jewish creators, and even though they were not able to be overtly Jewish in their comics because the mass market would not support it at the time, you don't have to dig very deep at all to find those Jewish themes, to find those stories and those characters that are deeply, deeply meaningful from the Jewish perspective. So yeah, all comics are Jewish.
Rami, the pressure's off. Anything you'd like to add?
I'll take what one of each of them said.
Excellent.
I think that's the truth. I think that a Jewish comic is different for each individual. I mean, what's Jewish for me may be different than what's Jewish for somebody else, but I think if it's something that either comes from a place of Jewish value or heritage or history, or speaks to a place of Jewish value, history, or heritage, it can be considered Jewish, even if it isn't expressly Jewish. Now, similar to what Dani was saying, though, I think that there is a lot in the direction we're going where it is a lot more shining a light on what the creators, their Judaism, the content itself and their Judaism. I don't think it has to specifically come off as preachy, but I do believe that that a true Jewish comic would have an element to it that is Jewish a lot more than just if it was just a regular story.
A lot of our panelists have already touched on this, but I'd like to delve into the conversation further in terms of the fact that Jewish individuals have long been active in all areas of the comic book industry. However, they may not have been comfortable in sharing this information about themselves. So what is your knowledge of how Jewish people have been involved in the industry since its inception? And do you feel that the fear of anti-Semitism has abated over time? Danny, why don't we start with you this time?
Oh, boy. Let me take the second part of the question first, which is this notion of anti-Semitism as a limitation, as a constriction on what you can safely write, what you can safely put out into the world. And we're past a point, I would hope, where you simply cannot write main Jewish characters, or you cannot write overtly Jewish stories. But that's not to say that anti-Semitism has gone anywhere, because it hasn't. And that's not to say that the fear of it has gone anywhere, because it hasn't. We're able to be more open, more direct in our response to that fear, to sort of try and take it on head on. But I remember when a conversation I had with my publisher when we started working on the Unfinished Corner, and having this sinking feeling that I would be able to set, by the simple act of putting a Jewish book out into the world, that I would be able to set my watch by when I would get called something unconscionable on social media. And that's, it's the world we live in. And the only way you can fight it is to keep going and keep putting joyous and authentic stories out into the world and try and drown out the noise.
Rami, what about you?
Yeah, I mean, I think that we're seeing a lot, especially in the younger ages, we're seeing a lot of anti-Semitism actually, I see at least, as spurring what I believe is a positive approach, which is, you're not going to scare me by being anti-Semitic. I know for years there were a lot of young kids in the teenage and early 20s who would, especially in Hollywood where I started off, like, I wear my kippah now, I wear it everywhere, and I went to meetings at some of the big studios and I would wear a baseball cap. And it was not that I didn't look Jewish without it, because I don't know many people that look more Jewish than I do, even with a baseball cap. But the reality is, I see now a lot of young kids standing up when they see anti-Semitism in play, and they're standing up and they're saying, I am Jewish. And I think that in the comic industry, whether it was specific to the comic books or not, I think that was just what was happening in the time. People were scared because they didn't think they'd get the jobs, they didn't feel they'd get the respect they need. I don't know that anti-Semitism is changing, but I think the response to it is. I think nowadays more people are willing to stand up and say, you can threaten me with a stick, you can threaten me with a stone, you can threaten me with words, it doesn't matter, I am Jewish, and if you don't like it, that's your problem, not mine. I am Jewish and I'm proud to be Jewish. And I think the real key here behind it is anti-Semitism. We should not be looking to change anti-Semitism, we should be looking to change how we respond to it.
Fabrice?
I'm going to get back to my story for a second, because I grew up in France, and I spent the vast majority of my adult life there until I moved to the US 7 years ago. And it's a very different experience being Jewish in a country like that, where we're very few, but also where anti-Semitism is everywhere. And it is systemic over there. And so I remember, like, when I was a kid, or when I was growing up, being Jewish was mostly being hidden. And so as a creator, it was like, even if I have a Jewish character, when I started writing, even if I have a Jewish character, I would cloak that character so it would be Jewish and recognizable to the people who were Jewish, but it would not be, or she would not be openly Jewish out of fear. Because even though there are some graphic novels and there are some comics on the French market that are dealing with the Jewish experience, mostly they're not by Jewish people. And they're historians, they're like curious people, like, and when you bring the issue to the publisher, they're like, where's the problem? And coming here to America was extremely liberating, because I could now be in control and publish the characters that I really wanted. So it was like kind of like a okay, now I can come out, I'm Jewish. And when I was in New York, I had the opportunity to create the first Jewish Comic-Con, which was, to my knowledge, the only Comic-Con in a synagogue in Brooklyn. And it was great because not only was a Jewish comics experience in a synagogue, but it was also inclusive, because I was very positive that if we have a mission, because we have this incredible medium called comics, is to tell everyone else who we are. A lot of Jews don't do a great job communicating properly about who we are because of fear, because of retaliation, because of a lot of trauma. But we have this medium called comics where we can say, okay, we're Jewish and we're cool. And what we're doing is great, because who we are is great, and we are inclusive, and we are diverse, and we have all the colors, and we come in every kind and every shape and every origin. This is who we are. That was a revelation for me.
So if I could jump on to that.
Please, yeah.
So your question was really about this sort of historical impact, I suppose, of anti-Semitism on the comics industry. My area of expertise, despite having just written a comic, is more the movie side of things. And certainly in Hollywood, the fear of anti-Semitism repressed the Jewishness of the Jewish founders of the industry. And the reason I want to connect this to what you were just saying, Fabrice, is that I see an interesting sort of feedback loop that results from that. Because what ended up happening is that very few overtly Jewish stories were told by the biggest, most powerful storytelling mechanism that the world has ever known. And then when Jewish stories were told, they were told through a particular lens of discomfort. Starting way back with films like The Jazz Singer and going all the way through to today, the tendency in Hollywood when it came to portraying Jews and Judaism was to portray two types. It was either the secular, often anti-religious, or at best agnostic. Self-hating is a term for it, but that I think doesn't encompass the sort of entire scope of it. It could be not even knowledgeable enough to know what to hate. But the secular New York Jew with some psychological issues, with ancestry in Eastern Europe. That was one type. And the other type was the opaque Hasidic type with the black cat and the peyot and the white shirt, who was usually impenetrable and old-fashioned and backwards. And those were the two types in Hollywood. And that has continued, and it continues for the most part to today. Even very contemporary Hollywood depictions of Jewish characters, to tie this back to comics, even you look at the way Moon Knight is portrayed, Eastern European heritage, frustration with that heritage, very, very loose association to that heritage. Moon Knight has this extra layer where he's actually working for an Egyptian god, when our origin story is about emancipation from Egypt. So we're still facing, in the mainstream, we're still facing this very narrow depiction. And that, to my mind, spirals back out, because if that narrow depiction comes from a discomfort with being overtly Jewish and expressing this broad range of what it means to be Jewish and Jewish identity and Jewish culture and all that, what the world gets is this very narrow sliver of Judaism. And yes, there are Jews from New York who are secular, who don't like religiosity, who come from Eastern Europe. It is authentic, but it's a very narrow sliver. And then there's this other narrow sliver, and in between there's this big gap. Now, especially now in the age of conspiracy theories and whatnot, we have learned that humanity has a tendency to fill in gaps. If we don't tell the stories that fill in those gaps, everybody else is going to do so. And so the anti-Semitism gets reinforced and grows further, because people see, well, there must be more to Judaism than just this and this, and we're not giving them what that more is, so they make it up, and often to our detriment.
Well, if I could jump in on that, anti-Semitism is a particularly insidious form of prejudice because so much of it is predicated on the notion that Jews have a level of power that we don't. And we don't, by the way.
And in comics, we don't either.
Right. I used to joke that, that there were people sort of espousing this conspiracy theory that Jews were going to replace the world population, and my answer to that is, with what? Because in a span of time in which the world population has more than doubled, the Jewish population hasn't even made up the numbers we lost in the Holocaust. We are for being sort of stereotypically good at math, we're really not calculating this correctly for world domination. But the point is that historically, anti-Semitism goes hand in hand with every other prejudice that the US in particular has ever had. You look at the swimming pools and the country clubs and whatever, and it was no gays, no Jews, no blacks. Always, right? But the anti-Semitism is the one where it's very, very difficult to fight back because you have to be so careful about perpetuating that idea that you have a level of power. And I think that's one of the reasons that there's such a fear of it in Hollywood, such a fear of telling overtly Jewish stories, because you cannot perpetuate the notion that you are controlling the children or sending out hidden messages about the Jewish space laser that we definitely have, by the way.
I really want to make that movie.
Mel Brooks did it.
I almost wore my Jewish space laser pin. I had it in my drawer and I forgot it. But yeah, people tend to forget in the narrative of American prejudice that anti-Semitism has been there the entire time. That the Ku Klux Klan hunted down Jews just as much as they hunted down Black Americans. It's been woven into the fabric of American prejudice since the very beginning, but it's difficult to talk about without accidentally perpetuating the very narrative that it puts forward, and that makes it very, very challenging.
In continuing in what Arnon was saying, in terms of there being an opportunity or perhaps also a burden to fill in those gaps in terms of representation, I want to go to the time before each of you were involved in your respective industries. Do you remember the first time you consumed a movie, a comic book, some type of media in which you saw a Jewish character represented, and what was that representation? Was that a positive experience? Was that a negative experience? Fabrice, we'll start with you.
It's funny because the first memory that I have of seeing a Jewish character in comics, I was like, it's not like me. And it also comes from the fact, it is exactly what Arnon was saying, of the Ashkenazi narrative that is going on in America because most of the American Jews are Ashkenazi. And I'm a child of two cultures. My mother's family is from North Africa, so I'm half Sephardi and half Ashkenazi, which in those days when my parents met was considered a mixed marriage. So it was like, you too?
Yep.
So, and so I was reading this story that was actually printed in French in an issue of Superman where you had, he was visiting a rabbi for Hanukkah, I think, or Passover. I mean, it's always one of the two.
There are no other holidays.
Yeah, absolutely. No other holidays than Hanukkah and Passover. And I was like, this is not the traditions that I'm used to. So I had this real weird feeling of, I'm seeing this character, but this is not the Jews that I know. And then I read Moon Knight. Awful. Look, son of a rabbi turned like adorator or servant of an Egyptian god, and yeah, you're right. Like every year we go and trying to remember how we escaped. And this comic book every month bring us back to, no, you didn't really escape, you're still there. Remember Amalek, it's still here. So yeah, no, it's not a great experience. And again, it fuels your desire to write your own stories and to to actually, fill the gaps and write as many stories and as many different Jewish stories to just show the world our colors.
Rami?
I mean, it's a very interesting question because I don't have an answer as to the earliest, but I can tell you the most impactful. And I've been trying to remember the name of the film. I just can't remember for the life of me. Somebody will be able to shout it out. But it was Edward Norton, and it was a story about a rabbi and a priest fighting over the love of a secular woman. Keeping the faith, thank you. And what I really, truly enjoyed, the structural elements of the movie, it hit me in such a strong manner that this is the depiction that not only they're placing on Judaism, but on religion. That what is religion? It's two different religions fighting each other over the secularism. Secondarily, it legitimately, as I recall, it left a really bad taste in my mouth because it played the elements of the religiosity as the negative. It wasn't that, oh, it's so beautiful that this priest holds these feelings and the Jew holds these feelings, and that's what's attractive about them. It was, well, this is why he's bad, and this is why he's bad, and she has to choose which is the less of the two bads. I mean, to me, that's really, I think, where we talk about these gaps that we're filling in. I think that's a big piece of it. It's definitely pervasive in the film industry. I mean, I avoid name dropping at every opportunity I can because I hate it. It sounds horrible. But when I first got into the film business, I took a course where a guest speaker was John Singleton, who is obviously, may rest in peace, but he was a very, very famous black director. And it was interesting because I had probably met about 5 or 6 Jewish executives that I had pitched an idea to. It was John that actually said, that's an interesting idea, let's try to take it to an executive. And it was a Jewish concept. And one of the reasons I asked him why afterwards, I said, well, it's very strange, what are your thoughts? And he actually said that one of the reasons is because he felt we had a lot in common. Because for him to go pitch an executive at Fox or wherever, the idea of making a movie is simple, straightforward, it's what it is. But if he's pitching another African American, they don't like it as much. So as a Jew, they were coming in, and because I think what I took out of what he was saying was, well, my Jewish message may be different than yours, so I don't want to give you control of my Judaism. And he was saying the same thing, that the African American executives were saying, well, what it means to me to be black is not necessarily for you, so I don't want to give you control. And I think that speaks to what we're all talking about here, which is this notion of we're the ones putting out the message, and we're the ones putting out a message that is not who we really are. I mean, we can sit in a room, whether you're Hasidic or whether you're completely secular, and we're people. And we're Jews. And yeah, we all share a heritage, and whether it's Ashkenazi or Sephardi. I mean, my wife's family is Sephardi. God, the first couple times I was there, I felt like I was in outer space, and it was like, what in the world is happening right now? But at the end of the day, we're still all Jews. I'm going to be at their house tonight, Friday night for dinner, and it's not like we're going to do Friday night dinner differently. And I think that's really a big piece of it. Yeah, exactly. And now I know why you turned down the invitation. But yeah, to bring it back to the original question, I don't remember the earliest representation that I saw, but the most impactful ones that I've seen are not good stories. They're not positive messages about Judaism. It's all, we're going to point out what's wrong with Judaism or the identity of being Jewish, and we'll make a story around that. And I personally find that to be horrific. So.
I'd like to go to Danny next, but Danny, I'm going to ask a different question because, Rami, you brought up a really interesting point in that, as is often the case with marginalized characters, when there are a dearth of opportunities for representation, those few opportunities carry a really heavy burden in needing to represent various different lived experiences for people within those communities. So how do you view the challenge of proper Jewish representation in comics, aside from there simply needs to be more? Danny, we'll start with you.
I'm really glad that you asked that, because that was something that I wanted to address directly in the Unfinished Corner. So my Jewish background is the second most stereotypical you can have after the, Brooklyn, everything that you said. I am a Northwest London middle-class Ashkenazi Jew. My mother's a teacher, my father's a lawyer. You look up Jewish in an illustrated dictionary, you get a picture of my dad. And so, that's my experience, and it aligns quite neatly with the sort of popular depiction of contemporary Judaism. But it's not the only Jewish experience. There are Sephardi Jews, there are black Jews, there are Asian Jews, there are Jews from all over the world, and I didn't want any reader to come to this book and go, am I not Jewish enough for it? So we were very, very deliberate in making sure that, yes, we've got we've got a New York Ashkenazi Jew, but we also have a Latina Jew with Sephardic heritage. We have a black Jew who's mixed race, and he's got an afro, and we wanted to be very, very clear that his experience is specific, that his look is unambiguous. I remember a story my grandfather told me, and my grandfather also, you look up Jew in an illustrated dictionary, and the second picture you see is my grandfather. And he lived in Japan for a while, and wanted to find some community, and so he found a community of Japanese Jews. Actual Japanese Jews, not immigrants, Japanese people who were Jewish and went to synagogue. And he went to a Shabbat service and had a lovely time and felt very welcomed, and afterwards went up to the rabbi and said, I just wanted to thank you for giving me this experience, for allowing me to find community while I'm here in this foreign land. Thank you so much for that. And the rabbi thanks him and says, it's my honor, we're happy to have you, but if you don't mind my saying, you don't look Jewish. And that's always stuck with me because, one, it's hilarious. But two, for this community of Japanese Jews, looking and sounding and acting Jewish was looking, sounding, and acting like them, because this was their Jewish experience. And so it's so much broader than popular culture would have us believe, than even our own experiences quite often would have us believe. And I think we have to be deliberate about displaying that diversity and, painting with every available color.
I'd love to hop onto that if I may.
Please, absolutely.
Because you asked about the challenges of telling stories. I see this as actually the great opportunity. Mm-hmm. This is probably the greatest gift that we can give to the world right now. This idea that you can be part of something and also distinct from it. That your difference is the thing that makes you the same as the other person who is also different. I think that within Judaism there are so many types of Judaism, in the way that within humanity there are so many types of humanity. And we are all so unique and so distinct that our very difference is the one thing that binds us all together. It's the one thing that we all have in common. And I think that from a Jewish experience, we can kind of recognize that and share that story, and help us all kind of recognize that in difference we have unity, in difference we have something that we can kind of hold on to that connects us, rather than trying to create boxes or silos or definitions that set people apart. So yeah, that story about your grandfathers is just kind of a perfect illustration of this idea that our difference is exactly that. It's the thing that we have in common.
Absolutely. And first and foremost, I want to say this is hands down. I've been engaged in a lot of panels at Comic-Con this year. One of the most insightful conversations. So first and foremost, I hope that you were enjoying it. I want to be mindful of the fact that there may be a lot of questions from the audience that you'd like to ask of the panelists, and we have only about 10 minutes left because it has been a wonderfully engaging conversation. So is there anyone in the audience who has a question for our panelists? Yes.
So I've heard you say something about PJ Arway, and I heard, Danny, you mentioned something about the National Jewish Book Awards, I believe. Do you feel like PJ Library and the National Jewish Book Awards have really helped to create more content and really helped to elevate Jewish writers, artists, illustrators, comic books? Do you think those things have helped, or have they hindered because they've also allowed a lot of different, as you mentioned earlier, people who aren't necessarily Jewish to tell stories from a Jewish perspective?
So I can speak about PJ Arway.
Do you want me to tell you?
I'm happy to kind of share a little bit about what it, so we got, I got and the illustrator also. We got an author incentive award, which basically gives money for either, it starts off with just an award for the manuscript, and then when we finish the book, we got more. It's money. Money's really, really helpful because it allows us to eat, which allows us to live, to write another book. And one of the challenges, of course, with any of this stuff is that if you write something and nobody buys it, eventually you change careers or die. And so anything that puts more money into the pockets of the people who are creating this content is going to help create more of this content. This book was also picked up by PJ Arway as one of the books that they distribute. So PJ Library, PJ Arway, they buy up books in very large quantities and then give them away for free to Jewish kids all over the place, which is wonderful. It means the stories actually get out there. It also puts a little bit more money into the pockets of the people who are creating the stories, which is really, really important. So I think that any effort that helps to get the stories out and that does it in a way that makes them, financially useful to create is going to help get more of them out. So I definitely celebrate their efforts and what they're doing because I could pay the mortgage with it a little bit.
And to
So
ease
if I
any
can jump
fear-
in on that, actually.
Please, I'm sorry.
Yeah, first of all, I 100% agree with what Arnon is saying. It's incredibly important for there to be multiple different venues of distribution and multiple different opportunities for the creators to actually pay bills, which is, in the comic business, is very difficult. A lot of times comics just don't make as much money as we'd like them to. But there is also a gap in that space, and while I think that those publishing houses really have opened the door, I think what they've done more than anything really is show that there's a demand for it. I think that they've done an amazing job showing creators just what you can do with Jewish content. I don't want to speak obviously negatively about anybody, but I think there's a gap, and Arnon and I were talking about this actually a little bit earlier, there's a gap in the Jewish storytelling where the quality of the story isn't the focus. If I were to try to go pitch a comic over at Marvel, they're going to be looking at their metrics, and DC's going to look at their metrics, but the key behind all this stuff is they're going to be looking at good storytelling first and foremost. Well, they'll be looking at money first and foremost. Secondarily, they'll be looking at good storytelling. Not to shamelessly pitch ourselves here, but this is one of our big focuses with what we're doing in the Jewish world. This is not just, it's a Jewish comic, great, let's put it out there. It's got to specifically be, the story has to be important. The characters have to be really well told stories. They have to be, the art has to be above par. We have to stand out with the quality, and it has to be able to stand in the same room and the same book. There has to be our books and everyone else's books, and the art and the story all have to line up with what the rest of the world non-Jewish oriented comics are coming out with. And then we really do have an opportunity to expand that. I mean, my editor-in-chief from our company is here today, and it's probably not because he's here to make sure I don't say anything stupid, but it's because there really is a huge opportunity here, and he wants to learn about it as well, because we're going to be doing a lot with that. But gentlemen, I haven't actually read these other books, and I definitely have to, but gentlemen like Arnon, who I've known for years, focus on story is incredibly important to him. So as somebody who puts up the money to get guys like him able to write stuff, I know I can trust him to tell a really well told Jewish story, and I can trust him with our money because he's focused on the story. He's not saying, here's a Jewish ideal that I'm going to tell the world about. I'm just going to write a character that says I'm going to do that. If he wanted to tell a story about the importance of keeping Shabbos, he wouldn't tell it as a rabbi telling the child the story of keeping Shabbos. And if you do tell them that way, you're not going to get the same kind of effect. So I think that there has been a massive opening of the market from organizations like really all of them actually. There's more than just those two. They've opened the market up. They've created an opportunity for us and creators to now come in and tell the entire spectrum of Jewish stories in a way that really can expand. I think it's great.
And one thing I would add very, very briefly is these organizations are wonderful and have created opportunities, I think, for every person on this panel. But I wish that we would start to see Jewish stories spoken about as minority stories in the same way that queer stories are spoken about, that black stories are spoken about, indigenous stories, etc. Because especially in comics, but especially on screen, the degree of Jewish representation, of authentic Jewish representation, is so low. It's
Authentic is the operative word there.
embarrassing.
Yeah.
It is embarrassingly low, and it is so tied to stereotype. By and large, we're allowed to be funny and we're allowed to be dead. And that's it. And so I want there to be this broader recognition that Jewish stories are minority stories too, and we deserve to have those stories elevated alongside every other minority group that wants their stories told and given to a broader audience.
I want to say something about that. Thank you, Danny. This is why I created my company, because I've worked in comic book publishing for 25 years. And every time I saw an issue with representation at the big or smaller publishers, they were like, that's great, you're on your own. Up to the point where you have to do it yourself. And that's what I decided to do. And I created Fair Square Comics in 2019 exactly for that. Because yes, I want more representation of every color, every race, every culture, but I want also to start with us and have an authentic representation of what Jews are, because as Arnon said, we can't be put in any box because we belong to all the boxes. And like we could be like the Russian dolls times 15 million. There are as many ways of being Jewish as there are Jews themselves. But we have to keep doing this, and we are on our own. I remember having conversation with big publishers, and this book you see here, Intertwined, which contains, to my knowledge, the only Asian Jewish modern Orthodox character that you can find in comics, has been met with a lot of resistance when I pitched it to a lot of studios in 2016. And Dynamite picked it up, and they completely screwed it over in the distribution department, in the promotion department, up to the point where I was a hostage to my own book. And what I had to do was to wait 5 years until the contract lapsed to republish it under my own colors and make it right. Because when they don't understand, they just don't want to. They just don't care. All they saw here was a book with a kung fu vibe. They didn't see the Jewishness and all. And now I'm working on a spinoff which is mainly centered on the Jewish character of the book. And yes, there will be kung fu, but it's a Jewish story.
I think a lot of it also has to do with all of you. I mean, we can shout into the wind as much as we want, but if our shouts are not amplified, they're not really going to go anywhere. And really, I think as much as possible, if, when we're sharing our new content, if you find out about it and you're excited about it, tell your friends, tell other people, spread it out there. And because ultimately, the stories that get retold are the stories that are popular. And so if we want these stories to get retold and to reach people and to expand the palette of what it means to be a Jewish character and to tell a Jewish story, that we need all of your help to do that.
Yeah. Well, I know that we have a few questions, and I apologize. I think we have time for only one. You've had your hand up for quite a while, so please go right ahead. Yes.
Are you coming on me?
Yes.
I'm blind.
I apologize. Yes.
My name is Michelle. I love this panel, and I love and crave the authentic lived experience stories. My question is going to be more nuanced. I'm just wondering what your thoughts are around dealing with some of the political issues, like around Israel, because Jews are not separated from Israel, and policies and that kind of thing. Do you think comic books are an appropriate, or graphic novels are an appropriate avenue to try to deal with those kinds of nuances? Because you're absolutely right about the insidiousness of anti-Semitism in all of the political work that I did here in San Diego. Thank you.
I think if enough stories are told, some of those stories can delve into the politics. If enough stories are told, some of those stories can delve into the politics from all the different angles as well, because Judaism is not monolithic politically either. So I think that yes, absolutely, all the stories should be told, as many of them as possible, as broadly as possible. The dangerous ones, the safe ones. The risk, I think, is so much greater when we leave gaps in the narrative. When we say, well, we shouldn't tell that story. Someone else is going to come in and tell that story for us. And if we don't take ownership of our narratives, we lose control of them.
And let me say, by the way, and this is something that's come up a lot for me because of the timing of when this came out, that the assumption that by nature of being Jewish, we must have a position on what is going on in Israel and the Middle East is in and of itself a form of anti-Semitism. It is making a blanket assumption that we must think a certain way because of who we are, and that is not the case. For many, many contemporary Jews living outside of Israel, what is going on there has little to no bearing on our everyday life, and it is uncomfortable and offensive for it to be assumed that we must have a position and we must express that position.
And
if it's
even
not the
within
story,
Israel.
right?
Oh, yeah.
It's
There are
not
probably more
always the
opinions within
story
Israel
we're
than outside
telling, guys.
Unfortunately, I do have to stop us because we are at time. We want to be mindful of the next panel. I want to give a very brief moment, if you wouldn't each mind sharing where our audience can find you, either at the convention or online. Arnon, we'll start with you.
My website is arnonshore.com. My book, Jose and the Pirate Captain Toledano, is available where books are sold, Amazon, Bookshop, etc. This book was actually an expansion of a story I first told in a short film called The Pirate Captain Toledano, which you can stream on Amazon or HiFlix. And yes, I love hearing from people. So if you have more questions, I'm easy to find online. My name is fairly unique.
Fabrice?
Same for me. My name is very unique. I have a first name that no American can pronounce, or no other barista in Starbucks. But you can find me at fairsquarecomics.com or at Fabricifolski everywhere on the internet. And our books are from Fair Square Comics. They're also available everywhere books are sold. And I encourage you to discover Intertwined. That is this book, and you can buy it either on our website or directly in stores.
Danny?
You can find me all over the internet at Danny Writes Stuff. That is my Twitter handle, that is my Instagram handle. My website is dannywritesstuff.com. The Unfinished Corner is available everywhere books are sold. And I am a Jewish Book Council touring author, so if you are associated with a Jewish community center, school, library, or anything similar, please do get in touch with the Jewish Book Council if you would be interested in having me for an event.
And Rami?
Check out oximedia.com, Google SourcePoint Press. At the moment, you're not going to find very many Jewish books on there because we've just started releasing them, but definitely keep an eye on it because there's going to be a lot more. And check out all of our other books as well. But oximedia.com and SourcePoint Press are what you'd look for us. And we're also at most of the conventions. You can generally find us with a pretty big booth. We don't have a booth at this convention today, but no, unfortunately today we don't have a booth. It's but generally, yeah. If you're a regular at conventions, you'll find us pretty prominently. But check us out online at oximedia.com and SourcePoint Press.
And you can find Fanbase Press at fanbasepress.com on all of the social medias. We're also in the small press at table 03. I want to say a massive thank you again to all of the panelists for sharing your experiences, your knowledge, your insight.
Thanks for your expert moderation.
And lastly, I want to say a big thank you to all of you. I know we were all the way down here at the end of the convention center. Thank you for making it, for choosing to be here, and enjoy the rest of your conference.